They laughed when she walked into the general store. Not the quiet, polite kind of laughter that people pretend isn't happening. The loud, open kind, the kind that follows a person out the door and down the street and into their sleep at night. "There she goes," said Earl Dunmore, loud enough for half the store to hear. He was leaning against the counter the way he always did, like the place belonged to him. One boot crossed over the other, hat pushed back on his head. Clara Whitmore, big as a barn and twice as useful for storing things nobody wants. The men laughed. A woman near the fabric bolts pressed her lips together and looked away. She didn't say anything, nobody did. Clara kept walking. She picked up a sack of flour, set it on the counter, counted out her coins with steady hands, and didn't look at Earl once. But her jaw was tight. Her teeth were pressed together so hard her molars ached. She was 26 years old, and she had been enduring this town her entire life. If you've ever been the person everyone looks through, instead of if you've ever stood in a room full of people and felt completely alone, then you already know exactly how Clara Whitmore felt walking out of that store. This is her story, and it does not go the way anyone expected. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now, because the stories we tell on this channel are the kind that stay with you. Hit the like button and drop a comment below telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to know how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to Red Hollow and to the woman they all underestimated. Red Hollow is not a cruel town by design. Most places aren't. Cruelty has a way of spreading quietly, like rot in a fence post. You don't notice it until the whole thing gives way. It was a working town, the kind where survival took up most of a person's day, and manners were considered a luxury. The people there weren't educated in the classical sense, but they had strong opinions, and they held them fiercely. They believed in appearances. They believed that a man's worth was in his land and his muscle, and a woman's worth was in her figure and her silence. Clara Whitmore had neither the figure they admired nor the silence they expected. She was heavy-set in a way that people in Red Hollow could not seem to look past. Not overweight from laziness, she worked harder than most men in that town, hauling water, tending her mother's small plot of land, fixing fences, carrying things that would have strained a man twice her size. Her body was strong and capable, but it didn't match the narrow ideal the town had decided was acceptable, and so she was treated like a problem that hadn't been solved yet. Her father had died when she was 13. Her mother, Margaret, had a bad hip and a worse cough, and she depended on Clara for nearly everything. Clara didn't resent it. She had simply grown up faster than other girls, learned things earlier, and somewhere along the way had developed a mind sharp enough to cut glass. She could calculate crop yields in her head. She knew which plants grew best in which soil. She could look at the sky in the morning and tell you with reasonable accuracy what the afternoon was going to bring. None of that mattered to Red Hollow. What mattered to Red Hollow was that she was 26 and unmarried, and when men came calling on the Whitmore property, which happened twice, in her younger years they left quickly and quietly, and the reasons they gave were never spoken plainly, but were understood by everyone. Clara was not what they were looking for. She had learned to carry that knowledge the way you carry a stone in your boot. You get used to the weight. You forget it's there most of the time. And then you take a step and the pain flares fresh and you remember all over again. The morning after the incident at the general store, Clara was up before dawn. She always was. The animals needed feeding, the water barrel needed filling, and her mother needed her tea ready before the coughing started. Clara moved through these tasks the way she moved through most of her life efficiently, without complaint, thinking 3 steps ahead. It was while she was carrying water from the well that she first saw him. A horse she didn't recognize was tied up outside the Granger boarding house, across the road, a big gray animal with a calm, patient look about it, the kind of horse that had traveled far and knew how to wait. Clara noticed it the way she noticed most things, practically with detail. The saddle was worn but well maintained. The saddlebags were full. The animal had been rubbed down recently, which meant its rider had come in late but taken the time to care for it before sleeping. That told her something about the man before she'd ever laid eyes on him. She didn't think much more about it. She carried her water inside, made her mother's tea, boiled herself an egg, and sat down to review her seed records for the spring planting. She didn't meet Wyatt Callahan until 3 days later, and it happened in the worst possible way. It was market day, which meant the main street of Red Hollow was crowded and noisy, and everyone who was anyone was out in the open air making themselves visible. Clara disliked market day. The crowds meant more eyes, which meant more comments, which meant more of the particular exhaustion that came from spending an hour in public in Red Hollow. She had a short list of things to trade and one thing to buy, a length of rope for the fence post. her mother had been asking about for 2 weeks. She moved through the stalls with her head up and her expression neutral. She had perfected this expression over years of practice, a kind of careful blankness that said, "I am not available for your opinions today." She was standing near the dry goods stall, examining a coil of rope, when Earl Dunmore appeared. He had 3 friends with him, men whose names Clara knew but didn't consider worth remembering in any meaningful way. They were the kind of men who needed an audience to feel brave, and they'd had enough to drink that the audience they required had shrunk to each other. "You buying rope, Clara?" Earl said, loud enough for the nearby stalls to hear. "What for? You going to tie yourself to a husband?" Can't imagine who'd volunteer. His friends laughed. A few people nearby looked away in that particular way that people do when they want to pretend they haven't heard something. Clara set the rope down. She turned to face Earl with that careful blank expression, and she said, very quietly, "You finished?" It was not the response Earl expected. He had expected tears or silence or a bright red face. The flatness of her voice threw him for just a moment, and in that moment he pushed harder, because men like Earl cannot tolerate being thrown. "Finished?" he said. "Honey, I haven't started. I was just thinking you're real good with crops. Right? Maybe that's why you're out here buying rope. Trying to stake yourself to the ground before the wind carries you off." He made a gesture with his arms, miming something enormous, and his friends doubled over. What happened next was something Clara had not planned. A hand came down on Earl's shoulder, a large hand, attached to a long arm, attached to a man who had been standing at the next stall and had apparently been listening for the last 30 seconds. The hand was not gentle. It turned Earl around with a firmness that was not quite violence, but was not quite its opposite either. "You got something you need to say," the man said. "Say it somewhere else." Earl looked up. He was not a small man, but this one was taller, and the quiet in his voice was a different kind of quiet from Clara's, not controlled, but natural. Like he wasn't angry, like he simply didn't have a use for what Earl was doing and was not going to pretend otherwise. "This doesn't concern you," Earl said. "I'm making it my concern." Earl looked at him for a long moment, calculating. Then he looked at his friends. Then he looked back at the stranger. Whatever math he did in his head came out unfavorably, and he made a noise in his throat and walked away, his friends trailing after him like loose dogs. The stranger turned back to the dry goods stall without ceremony. He picked up a pair of leather gloves, examined them, set them back down. Clara stood there, holding the coil of rope and feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time, which was surprise. "You didn't have to do that," she said. He glanced at her. He had a weathered face, the kind that had spent a lot of time outdoors. Brown eyes with a steadiness in them that was neither friendly nor unfriendly, just honest. A jaw that needed a shave. His hat was dusty and his coat was the color of dried grass. "I know," he said. "I wasn't in danger. I know that too." Clara looked at him for a moment. Then why? He considered the question like it was a real one, and not just something people said. "Because it was a bad thing to watch, and I didn't want to watch it anymore." He said it plainly, without drama, as though stopping something unpleasant was no more complicated than shutting a door against the cold. Then he picked up the leather gloves again, decided on them, and moved toward the stall keeper to pay. Clara bought her rope. She walked home. She told her mother the fence post could wait another week because she'd bought the wrong weight and needed to go back. She'd bought exactly the right weight. She just needed a moment to herself. She found out his name from Mrs. Prentice at the boarding house, who told her everything she knew, which was not much. Wyatt Callahan, traveling through, no stated destination, paid his board 2 weeks in advance. He didn't drink heavily, didn't cause trouble, was up early and back late. He asked about work, Mrs. Prentice added. Farms needing hands. Fences needing mending, practical work. Clara filed this away the way she filed most information, quietly, without obvious purpose, in a place she could reach later. She didn't seek him out. She was too careful for that. Too familiar with the cost of wanting things openly in Red Hollow, where wanting the wrong thing or the wrong person was just another reason to laugh. But Red Hollow was a small town, and Wyatt Callahan was a man who was apparently unbothered by working outdoors in full view of everyone. And within a week, Clara had seen him 3 more times, once repairing old Granger's barn roof, once sitting outside the boarding house, cleaning his rifle with focused patience, and once standing at the edge of the churchyard, looking at the mountains in the distance, with an expression she couldn't quite read. Each time he saw her looking and nodded. Not the elaborate social nod that people in town traded like currency. Just acknowledgement, you exist, I see you, that's all. It was almost nothing. It was more than most people gave her. The first real conversation happened at the end of her mother's west field. Clara had been working since early morning, resetting the wooden stakes along the boundary where the soil had shifted over the winter. It was tedious, physical work, and she was halfway done and sweating through her coat when she became aware of someone standing at the field's edge watching her. She looked up. Wyatt Callahan. He wasn't watching the way people in town watched her, with that particular quality of assessment that was really just judgment waiting to be confirmed. He was watching the way someone watches a task being done competently, like he was learning something. That steak's off by about 3 inches, he said. Not unkindly, just accurately. Clara looked at the steak. Looked at her string line. He was right. She fixed it. You do this kind of work? Done most kinds, he said. You available tomorrow morning? He thought about it for exactly 2 seconds. What time? Sunrise, I'll be here. He was. He showed up at sunrise with his own tools and worked beside her without speaking more than was necessary. And what Clara noticed, what she catalogued carefully in the observant part of her mind that never really shut off, was that he worked the way she worked. Not to impress anyone, not to be seen, just to get the thing done right. By mid-morning, her mother appeared in the doorway and watched them for a while without saying anything. Later, over supper, she asked Clara about him. And Clara said he was a hired hand, and her mother gave her a look that Clara pretended not to see. Word traveled fast in Red Hollow. It always did. By the second day, people had noticed that Wyatt Callahan was working the Whitmore land. By the third day, the comments had started quieter than Earl Dunmore's market day performance, but present. The way comments always were in this town, sideways. Plausible deniability built right in. Couldn't find better work than that, I suppose. He must not know anyone here yet. Give it time. Clara heard some of these. She heard more than she showed. She was good at hearing things she wasn't supposed to hear and showing nothing because she had been practicing that particular skill since she was old enough to understand that people said things about her when they thought she wasn't listening. What she hadn't expected was Wyatt. On the 4th morning, standing near the water barrel, she told him flatly, "People are talking about you working here." Saying things. He poured water over his hands and didn't look up. Kind of things. The kind that suggest your judgment is questionable. He dried his hands on a cloth, then he looked at her with those steady brown eyes. Is my judgment questionable? Clara held his gaze. You're doing solid work, and I'm paying fair. That's not questionable. Then we agree, he said, and went back to work. She stood there for a moment, not quite sure what had just happened. She was used to people making her feel like a problem. She was not used to people simply declining to treat her as one. It was Margaret Whitmore who said it first that evening. She said it carefully. The way someone handles something fragile, that's a good man, Clara. Clara was washing the supper dishes. She didn't answer right away. He's good at what he does, she said finally. That's not what I said. Clara scrubbed a pot that was already clean. Outside, through the window, the last light was dying over the mountains, the sky going from orange to the particular deep blue that came just before dark. She thought about the market. She thought about the steady voice that had said, because it was a bad thing to watch, and I didn't want to watch it anymore. Like stopping something ugly was just a simple, obvious, uncomplicated act. Don't, she told her mother, not unkindly. Her mother didn't push. She was wise enough to know when her daughter was protecting herself, and why. But Clara stood at that window a moment longer than she needed to, watching the blue deepen to black, and she felt something careful beginning to shift somewhere behind her breastbone. She had learned a long time ago not to want things too plainly. Wanting things plainly in Red Hollow was an invitation for the town to take aim. She turned away from the window. She told herself it was nothing. She was not entirely sure she believed it. The thing about telling yourself something is nothing is that the nothing has a way of growing. Clara noticed it the way she noticed most things gradually, then all at once. One morning, she caught herself listening for the sound of his boots on the frozen ground before she'd even opened her eyes. Another morning, she realized she'd made enough biscuits for 2 without thinking about it. Small things. The kind of things that don't mean anything on their own and mean everything when you add them up. She didn't say a word about any of it, not to her mother, not to herself if she could help it. Wyatt had been working the Whitmore land for 3 weeks, when the first real trouble came, not the slow, grinding kind she was used to, but the sharp, sudden kind that lands before you have time to brace. Started with a visit from Tom Aldridge. Tom Aldridge was not a bad man in the way Earl Dunmore was a bad man. Earl was mean because he enjoyed it. Tom was mean the way a fence is mean, not out of malice, but because he was built to keep certain things out and certain things in, and he didn't see any reason to question the structure. He was the closest thing Red Hollow had to a community leader, though he held no official position. He owned the largest piece of land adjacent to the Whitmore property. He'd been born here, and he'd decided long ago that this made his opinions into facts. He came on a Tuesday morning, while Wyatt was resetting the posts on the north side of the property, and Clara was in the yard working through a pile of mending that had built up over the winter. Tom rode up slow, the way men ride when they want you to know they're not in a hurry, that they've got all the time in the world, and you're the one who ought to be nervous. "Morning, Clara," he said, without dismounting. "Tom," she kept her eyes on her mending. "What do you need?" He looked toward the north side of the property, where Wyatt's figure was visible at the tree line. "Heard you took on a hand. I did, outsider. He does good work." Tom shifted in his saddle. He had a way of pausing before he said difficult things, like he was doing you a favor by preparing you. "I came out of consideration, Clara. There's talk in town. People are wondering about the situation." Clara set down her mending. She looked up at him directly. "What situation is that, Tom?" "A single woman. A man living on the property." He said it carefully, like the words were made of something that could break. "He boards at Mrs. Prentice's place," Clara said. "He arrives at sunrise. He leaves at sundown. That's a hired hand, not a situation. People don't always see it that way. Then people need something better to do with their time." Tom's expression shifted. He wasn't used to Clara talking back. Most people in Red Hollow weren't, because Clara had spent 26 years learning that talking back cost more than it was worth. But something had changed in her these last 3 weeks, some small, stubborn thing that had decided it was done paying the cost. "I'm only telling you," Tom said, "because your father and I were friends. Out of respect for that." "My father's been dead 13 years, Clara said. "I appreciate you riding out." She picked up her mending again. Tom sat on his horse for another moment, looking at her, and then he turned and rode back down the lane without another word. Her hands were not entirely steady when she resumed her stitching, but they were steady enough. She didn't tell Wyatt about Tom's visit. She wasn't sure why, exactly some instinct for keeping things contained, for not letting the town's opinions into the space they'd built around the work. Whatever that space was, it was quiet and functional, and she didn't want it contaminated. But Wyatt found out anyway, because Red Hollow was small and Tom Aldridge was not a quiet man when it came to his opinions. He came back from town one afternoon with a look on his face that Clara had not seen before, not angry, but deliberate. Like he'd made a decision on the ride back and was now living in it. "Tom Aldridge talked to you?" he asked. Clara looked up from the seed records she'd been reviewing. "He came by. What'd he say?" "That people were talking." "About the situation." She said the last word the way Tom had said it, with the same careful weight. Wyatt sat down on the step across from her. He took his hat off and turned it in his hands, which was, she had learned, what he did when he was thinking something through. "And what did you tell him?" "That you board at Mrs. Prentice's and people need something better to do." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. "That's probably not going to settle it." "I know. Does it bother you?" She looked at him. It was a direct question, the kind that deserved a direct answer. "I've been talked about my entire life," she said. "It's not comfortable, but it's familiar. That's not the same as it not bothering you." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, a crow called from somewhere near the barn, and the sound hung in the cold air. "What bothers me," she said carefully, "is the idea that it might affect your work, or your ability to get work after this." He looked at her steadily. "That's not your concern to carry. It is if I'm the cause of it." "You're not the cause of it," he said. "Other people's small thinking is the cause of it. Those are different things." She didn't answer that, because she wasn't sure she agreed, and she didn't trust herself to argue the point clearly. She looked back at her seed records, and after a moment he put his hat back on and went back to work, and neither of them said anything more about it. But she thought about it that evening, long after he'd ridden back to the boarding house, and her mother was asleep, and the house was quiet. She thought about the way he'd said it, other people's small thinking, like it was a simple fact, like the responsibility for the town's cruelty genuinely belonged to the town, and not to whoever the town decided to aim it at. She had never quite been able to make herself believe that. She'd tried, but 26 years of being the target had a way of making you feel like maybe the arrow had a point. Earl Dunmore made his move on a Friday. Clara had gone into town alone. Wyatt was working the south fence, and she'd told him she'd be an hour, 2 at most. She needed to pick up a package at the post office that had been waiting for a week, a collection of farming manuals she'd sent away for, practical text on soil rotation and winter crop management that she'd saved 3 months to afford. She was standing at the post office counter, waiting for old Pete Marsh to locate the package when Earl came in. He wasn't alone this time either, but his companions were different, not the drinking friends from market day, but 2 men she recognized, Dale Croft, who ran the feed store, and Henry Purcell, who had a small but growing claim to the east of town. These were men with some standing. Earl had assembled an audience with weight. "I was hoping to run into you," Earl said, which was a lie they both knew. Clara looked at Pete Marsh, who was moving with deliberate slowness through the back room. She was trapped, and everyone present knew it. Earl, she said. Just his name, nothing else. There's something I've been meaning to ask you, Earl said, settling against the counter with that practiced ease of his. You and that drifter, Callahan. He's a hired hand. That's what I hear. Earl's voice was pleasant in a way that wasn't pleasant at all. I also hear he's been turning down other work. Dyer's place asked him, and Hendricks asked him, and he turned them both down to keep working your little patch of ground. He looked at Dale Croft. Now why do you suppose that is? Clara kept her eyes on the back room doorway where Pete Marsh had disappeared. Her jaw was doing the thing again, that clenching that ached. Could be he just likes the arrangement, Henry Purcell offered. He said it with a kind of studied casualness that made it clear exactly what kind of arrangement he was implying. There is no arrangement, Clara said. Her voice was level. She was proud of that. Of course not, Earl said. No offense meant. I'm just curious what a man like that sees that makes him want to stay around. Nothing wrong with wondering. He looked at her with those flat eyes. Must be something he finds I don't know convenient about the situation. Pete Marsh appeared with the package. Clara took it, put her coins on the counter, and walked toward the door. You know what I think? Earl's voice followed her. I think he feels sorry for you. Some men are like that. Have a weak spot for strays. She stopped walking. The room went very still. She stood at the door for a long moment, her back to Earl, the package in her arms, and she made a decision. Turned around. I think, she said, quietly and clearly, that you are a man who has never done a difficult thing in your life that you didn't have an audience for. And I think that frightens you more than you'd ever admit. So you stand around making yourself large at other people's expense, because it's the only way you know to feel like you matter. She was out the door before anyone could respond. Her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her ears. Her hands were shaking now, genuinely shaking, and she gripped the package tighter and walked faster. She turned the corner off Main Street and stopped behind the wall of DeLacy's Hardware, and stood there breathing, staring at the sky, waiting for her pulse to slow. She had never said anything like that to Earl Dunmore in her life. She did not know if it was brave or stupid. Probably both, she thought. Usually is. Wyatt was still at the south fence when she got back, and she almost didn't tell him. She almost went straight inside and put the package on the table and said nothing. But he looked at her when she came across the field, and whatever he saw in her face made him set down his tools and walk toward her. What happened? He asked. She told him, plainly without decoration. Earl, the post office, what Earl had said, what she'd said back. Wyatt listened with his arms crossed and his expression still, the way he listened to most things, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment. What do you want to do about it? He asked. She blinked. What do you mean? I mean, it's your call. He's been at you for years. You want me to stay out of it, I stay out of it. You want backup, I can provide that. But it's your situation and you know it better than I do. Clara looked at him. She had expected she wasn't sure what she'd expected. Some version of what other men might have done. An offer to go confront Earl. A dismissal of her concern. A suggestion that she'd probably overreacted. She had been ready for any of those. She wasn't ready for a question about what she wanted. I don't know yet, she said honestly. That's fine, he said. When you do know, tell me. He went back to his fence. She went inside and unpacked her farming manuals and made her mother's tea, and she sat at the kitchen table while her mother napped and read the first 30 pages of the first manual without retaining a single word, because her mind was elsewhere entirely. The town's next move came faster than she'd expected, and it came sideways the way the worst things usually do. Started with the Hartley girl. Nora Hartley was 17, the daughter of the Reverend, and Clara caught herself. Not the Reverend, she reminded herself. No religious references. Not that kind of town, the daughter of Martin Hartley, who ran the schoolhouse and had an outsized amount of influence over the social fabric of Red Hollow by virtue of controlling what the children learned and consequently what the parents talked about at supper. Nora was a bright, pretty girl who had been friendly to Clara in that superficial way that young girls in small towns are friendly to people they privately consider unfortunate, polite, a little distant, doing a charity she was barely aware of performing. Nora showed up at the Whitmore property on a Wednesday morning and asked to speak with Clara privately, which was unusual enough that Clara set down everything she was doing and gave her full attention. They sat at the kitchen table. Margaret had gone to lie down, and Wyatt was at the north pasture, and Nora twisted her hands together and looked at the tabletop. My father had a meeting with some men last night, Nora said. I wasn't supposed to hear, but the walls in our house aren't very thick. What men? Clara asked. Mr. Aldridge, Mr. Dunmore. Mr. Croft. Nora looked up. They were talking about you. About Mr. Callahan. About the situation, that word again. My father said he was going to write a letter to the county board about the impropriety, about how it sets a bad example for the young women in town. Clara felt something cold move through her chest. A letter to the county board. I don't know exactly what it said, but I heard him say it could affect your land claim. Nora's eyes were wide and genuinely worried. I know we're not. I know we haven't always been close. But I thought you should know. Clara looked at her across the table. She thought about the land. The Whitmore property wasn't large, 40 acres. Most of it decent farmland, some of it rocky, but it was everything. It was what she and her mother had. It was what Clara had poured her life into. Every repair, every fence post, every seed record, every plan for the following spring. The land claim had been in her father's name and had transferred to her mother on his death, and the legal standing of that transfer was something Clara had never thought to question because she had never had reason to. She thought about it now. Thank you for telling me, she said. Her voice was steady. She was very deliberately keeping it steady. I mean that. Nora nodded and left quickly, like she was afraid of what she might have started. Clara sat at her kitchen table alone for a long time after that. She didn't tell her mother. Margaret was not well enough for this kind of news, and Clara wasn't ready to put the fear in her eyes. She didn't tell Wyatt at first. Either she was still working through it, still trying to understand all the shapes of what it meant. What it meant was this: they weren't just mocking her anymore. They were trying to take something. She had understood the mockery. She had not expected the machinery. The letter, the county board, the formality of using respectability as a weapon that required coordination, planning. That required men who had decided she was worth the effort of destroying rather than just the pleasure of tormenting. She pulled out her father's papers that evening. She spread them on the table after her mother was asleep and read through every document she had: the original land grant, the transfer of title, the property survey from 1871, the tax receipts going back 11 years. She went through them twice, then a third time, looking for anything that could be used against her. Looking for gaps, vulnerabilities, anything that a letter to a county board could latch onto. She found one. It was small. It might mean nothing. But the transfer of title from her father to her mother had been witnessed by 2 men, one of whom had died 2 years ago. The documentation was thin enough that a determined county official could raise questions about its validity, especially if someone was already whispering in the right ears that the property was being run improperly. She sat with that for a long time. Then she went to the window and looked out at the dark, and thought about Wyatt asleep at the boarding house, and thought about how she had spent 26 years letting Red Hollow take small things from her comfort, her dignity, her belief in her own right to be somewhere, and she thought about how she was not going to let it take the land. She told him in the morning. She waited until he arrived, let him start on the day's work, and then called him over to the porch and told him everything. The meeting, the letter, the land title, the gap in the documentation. Wyatt listened without interrupting, which she had come to expect but still appreciated. When she finished, he sat on the porch step and looked at the ground for a moment. You already worked out what the problem is, he said. The witness, yes. Are there other documents? Anything else that establishes the transfer? Tax receipts in my mother's name, bank correspondence. But nothing with legal standing equivalent to the title itself. He was quiet. Then you know anyone with legal experience? Someone not from here? She paused. Not yet. He looked at her at that. Not yet means you're already thinking of something. She was. She had been awake most of the night thinking of it. There was a lawyer in Granton, the next town over, a man named Silas Booth, who had handled some correspondence for her father years ago. She didn't know if he was still in practice, didn't know what he charged, didn't know if he could help. But he was the one name she had. I'd need to get to Granton, she said. I'd need to leave my mother for a day, maybe 2. And I'd need— She stopped. What? I'd need to know the property is in good hands while I'm gone. Wyatt looked at her steadily. I can board here while you're away, if your mother is comfortable with it. She'll be more than comfortable, Clara said dryly. Corner of his mouth moved. Then go. I'll be here. She looked at him for a moment. She wanted to say something, she wasn't sure what exactly. Something about the fact that he was still here, still showing up, still treating this like his problem too, when it had nothing to do with him, except through her. She wanted to say something about what that meant, what she thought it might mean, what she was very carefully not letting herself fully think about. I'll leave tomorrow, she said instead. He nodded and stood up and went back to work, and Clara went inside to write a letter to Silas Booth and figure out which dress made her look most like someone a lawyer would take seriously. She was gone 2 days. She rode out before dawn on Thursday and she was back by sunset on Friday, and in between those 2 points she had a conversation with Silas Booth that was at turns encouraging and alarming, that cost her more than she'd wanted to spend, and that resulted in a document she carried home in her coat pocket like it was made of something valuable, which it was. Booth had told her the situation was manageable but not simple. The title transfer was thin but not invalid. The key was to establish a clear chain of use and possession, which the tax receipts helped with, and to obtain a secondary affidavit of witness from anyone else present at the time of transfer. There had been a third person in the room when the title was signed, a woman named Ruth Cass, who had been a neighbor of the Whitmore family and had moved to Granton 7 years ago. Booth knew her. He could arrange for her affidavit. It would take time, but it would hold up. What he couldn't help with was the informal part, the letter already sent, the ears already bent, the opinion already forming in whatever county official Tom Aldridge had targeted. For that, he told her, she needed to be visible and credible and unimpeachable in the local community, which was, Clara told him flatly, a significant challenge given the local community in question. Booth had looked at her across his desk with the particular expression of a man who has heard everything and is not easily shocked, and said, "Do you have anyone who can speak on your behalf publicly? Someone with standing in that community?" She thought of Wyatt. She said nothing about Wyatt. "I'll figure that out," she said. He was awake when she rode back in, sitting on the porch in the cold with a lantern which she hadn't expected. Her mother apparently had insisted on a lamp being kept burning. "How'd it go?" he asked. She told him. Sitting across from him on the porch in the dark, still in her riding coat, still carrying the cold of the 2-day trip in her bones, she told him everything Booth had said. She told him about Ruth Cass and the affidavit and the timeline. She told him about the local credibility problem and what Booth had said about needing someone to speak on her behalf. When she finished, Wyatt was quiet for a moment. The lantern threw soft moving shadows across the porch boards. "I'll speak on your behalf," he said, Wyatt publicly. "Wherever it needs to happen. Town meeting, county office, middle of the main street if that's what it takes." He looked at her directly. "I've been thinking about this the whole time you were gone. This isn't just about the land anymore. They're trying to make you disappear, make you small enough that you stop being able to fight back. I'm not going to stand beside that." Clara looked at him. The lantern light caught the lines of his face, the steadiness in his eyes that was always there, that she had never quite gotten used to. "You know what it costs you," she said, "publicly siding with me in this town. You know what they'll do." "I know what I think of what they'll do," he said. "Which is not much. That's easy to say now." "Yes," he agreed. "And I'm still saying it." The night was quiet around them. Somewhere in the barn, one of the horses shifted. The lantern flame bent in a breath of wind and steadied again. Clara had spent 26 years in a town that had made her feel like a liability, like something people had to make allowances for. She did not know quite how to absorb a man sitting on her porch in the cold saying he intended to stand beside her regardless of the cost. She did not know if she believed it all the way, not yet. She had been burned too many times by the distance between what people said and what they did. But she believed it enough. "You should go get some sleep," she said. "You've got an early start tomorrow. So do you. I've been traveling for 2 days. And I've been up worrying," he said. Simple as anything. And then stood up and carried the lantern inside, and she heard him settle on the cot they'd set up in the back room. And she sat on the porch alone for another few minutes in the dark, listening to the quiet. Up worrying. She turned the words over. Simple words. The kind that could mean nothing. The kind a man might say about a neighbor or a business concern or a dog that hadn't come home. She turned them over again and looked at them from a different angle and decided that she was tired, and it was late and she was going inside. She went inside. She did not sleep particularly well. 3 days later, Wyatt made good on his word. It happened at the general store, not planned, not staged, but organic in the way that the worst confrontations in small towns always are. Clara had gone in for coffee and lamp oil. Earl Dunmore was there. Tom Aldridge was there. Dale Croft was there, which made it feel less like coincidence and more like an appointment. Earl started in before the door had fully closed behind her. He was subtler this time, not the open, braying mockery of before, but the quiet, poisonous kind that played better in front of witnesses who liked to think of themselves as decent. "Heard you went to Granton," he said. "Lawyer?" Clara set her items on the counter. "Just business. Interesting time to have business in Granton." Earl looked at Tom. "Wouldn't you say, Tom?" Right when certain questions are being asked about property management. Tom cleared his throat. He had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable, which was more than Clara expected from him. "Clara," Tom said, "I want you to understand this isn't personal. It's about the standards, the community." The door opened. Wyatt came in. He hadn't been with her. He'd been at the hardware store 2 doors down, buying nails, a mundane errand they'd each run separately. But he walked in and read the room in about 2 seconds with those steady eyes, and he walked to stand beside Clara at the counter without a word. Not behind her, beside her. Earl looked at him. Tom looked at him. The store was very quiet, Tom Wyatt said. His voice was conversational, like he was talking about the weather. I've been meaning to speak with you. The Whitmore property is run as well as anything in this county. Better than most. Clara Whitmore knows this land, and she works it hard, and she does it right. Whatever letter got sent to whatever board, I'm happy to go on record, saying exactly that, in writing or in person, to whoever needs to hear it. Tom's expression shifted through several things in quick succession. You don't have standing here, Earl said. You're not from this town. No, Wyatt agreed, I'm not, which means I don't have a stake in keeping things the way they are. He looked at Earl with those flat, patient eyes. You do. That's a different thing. The silence stretched. Someone in the back of the store coughed. Earl's jaw was tight. He looked at Clara, and she looked back at him. And she did not look away, and she did not drop her gaze. And after a moment, Earl made that familiar noise in his throat and walked to a different part of the store. Tom Aldridge stood there for another moment. Then he looked at Clara, really looked at her, in a way she wasn't sure he'd done in years, maybe ever, and something moved across his face that she couldn't quite name. I'll think on some things, he said, which, from Tom Aldridge, was as close to an apology as anyone was going to get. He left. Clara paid for her coffee and her lamp oil. The storekeeper's hands were shaking slightly as he made change, which Clara noted with a grim private satisfaction. She and Wyatt walked out together into the cold street, and he picked up his nails from the hardware store, and they rode back to the property in silence for most of the way. You didn't tell me you were going to do that, she said eventually. You said you'd figure it out. I figured you were still figuring. I was, well. He glanced at her sideways. Now you've got one more thing figured. Clara looked straight ahead at the road. The mountains were very clear today, sharp against the sky. She thought about the letter at the county board and the affidavit making its way through Silas Booth's office and the slow, grinding work of proving yourself to people who had decided not to see you. She thought about Wyatt saying, beside her, without drama, without expectation of reward, I'm happy to go on record. She had been alone in this fight for 26 years. The feeling of not being alone was strange in her chest, not comfortable exactly, too unfamiliar for that. More like standing in a doorway, somewhere between inside and out, feeling the warmth on one side and the cold on the other, not yet sure which way she was going to step. She thought she was beginning to know. The horses moved steadily on the cold road. The mountains kept their distance, the way mountains do, reliable and enormous and indifferent to the small lives being sorted out below them. And Clara Whitmore rode home through the winter air with something she had not had in a very long time, something she was being careful with, turning it gently in both hands, like a thing that could crack under pressure. Not hope exactly, something more careful than hope. Possibility of it, the possibility of something Clara had learned was its own kind of danger. Not the obvious kind, not the danger of a bad man or a failing fence or a legal document with a hole in it. Quiet kind, the kind that settles in and makes you soft in places you'd spent years hardening, and then the world notices and comes for exactly those places. She rode back from the general store that day, with the mountains sharp against the sky, and something tentative moving in her chest, and for 2 weeks after that things were almost not good, exactly, but possible. The word Booth had used, manageable. The affidavit from Ruth Cass was in progress. Tom Aldridge had gone quiet, which was not resolution, but was at least the absence of escalation. Earl Dunmore continued to be Earl Dunmore, which was inevitable, but he had been publicly outmaneuvered twice now, and some of his audience had begun to find other entertainment. Wyatt kept working the property. He was good at it in a way that went beyond capability. He worked with a kind of attention that Clara respected. The way he'd notice something needed doing before she mentioned it. The way he'd stop and rethink a problem rather than power through it badly. She had hired plenty of men over the years' short stints, mostly men passing through who needed a few days' wages, and she had learned early that the difference between a man who worked and a man who thought while he worked was the difference between getting by and getting ahead. Wyatt thought while he worked. They had fallen into a rhythm that was comfortable, in a way she kept catching herself noticing. Morning coffee on the porch before the day started. Midday, she'd bring out something to eat, not elaborate. She was practical about food, and they'd sit on the fence rail or the step and eat and talk, sometimes about the work, sometimes about other things. He had opinions about crop rotation that matched hers in some places and diverged in others, and she liked the divergence, liked having something to argue against, that wasn't just spite wearing the costume of a position. He'd grown up in Kansas, she learned slowly, had worked cattle most of his adult life, had drifted west after something he didn't fully explain and that she didn't press, because she understood the particular right to keep certain things in the unmarked box at the back of your life. She offered a little of her own in exchange, not much. She was still careful, but she told him about her father, what he'd been like, sharp and funny and quietly fierce, the man who had taught her to read a weather sky and calculate soil pH before she was 10. She told him about the years after, about learning to do everything because there was no one else, about deciding that being capable was better armor than being liked, because liked could be taken away. He listened the way he always listened, which was completely. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked one afternoon. They were eating on the fence rail, her mother's bread and last autumn's apple preserves, and the day was cold but bright. Clara looked at the land around them. The particular way the light fell across the north field. The silhouette of the barn against the sky she'd been looking at since she was 5 years old. "Where would I go? Anywhere. This is the land," she said. "My father's land, my mother's only security. I don't have the luxury of anywhere." He nodded like he understood that. "And then would you want to, if you could?" She considered the question honestly, the way she tried to consider most things. "I don't know," she said. "Maybe the question I've been living in so long is how to stay that I've stopped thinking about the other one." He ate his bread and looked at the mountains. "That's an honest answer." "I try. You're good at honest," he said. "Better than most people." She looked at him sideways. "You say that like it's a compliment." "It is. Most people find it uncomfortable. Most people are more comfortable with comfortable lies," he said. "It's not a character flaw in them. It's just most people." "Are you most people?" "No," he said simply. "I don't think so." She looked back at the mountains. "No," she agreed quietly. "I don't think so either." She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. There were conversations that said the important thing inside the ordinary words, and you either knew how to hear them or you didn't, and Clara had been listening carefully her whole life. The storm came without much warning, the way the worst ones do. They had a few days of signs, the particular heaviness in the air that Clara knew to read, the way the animals got unsettled, the color of the clouds building over the mountains in the northwest, that had a depth to them she didn't like. She told Wyatt. He agreed. They spent 2 days moving supplies, double-latching the barn, hauling extra water and feed. She went into town and tried to say something to anyone who would listen, tried to suggest that people should be bringing in their stores, checking their cellars, preparing. Most people nodded politely and didn't do much. Tom Aldridge thanked her for the concern and said the almanac hadn't predicted anything severe. Earl Dunmore said something about women and weather that she didn't dignify with a response. The storm hit on a Tuesday night, and it was the worst Clara had seen in her 26 years in Red Hollow. Not the most dramatic. She'd seen lightning that lit up the sky like midday and winds that had taken barn roofs off clean, but the most sustained, the most total. Snow started at dusk and didn't stop. By midnight, the drifts were at the window level. By morning, the temperature had dropped to something that made the air feel solid, and the snow was still coming. She woke at 4 a.m. to a sound she couldn't identify, something wrong in the wrong register, and lay in the dark processing it for a moment before she realized silence. The well pump wasn't running. It had frozen. She got up. She got dressed in everything she owned, in layers, and she went to the back room where Wyatt had been sleeping on the cot he'd stayed the past week as the weather worsened, her mother insisting, and she put her hand on his shoulder and said his name. He was awake before she finished saying it. Combat instinct, she thought, or something like it. The readiness of a man who had slept in enough uncertain places that his body had learned to stay close to the surface. "Pump's frozen," she said. "I know. I've been listening to it for an hour." He was already sitting up, reaching for his coat. "What else?" She thought through it methodically. "Animals need checking. We've got enough water stored for 2 days, maybe 3 if we're careful. Food's not the issue short term. The bigger problem is the Brennan family. They're 3 miles north, and they had nothing laid in, and the Myers girl is pregnant and due any week, and old Samuel at the east edge of town is alone." He was putting his boots on. He looked up at her in the gray pre-dawn dark. "You already made the list before you woke me." "I made it at 2 in the morning when the snow started getting loud," she said. "Yes." He looked at her for a moment. Something moved across his face. It was not quite a smile. It was something serious than that, something that looked like recognition. "What do you need from me?" "I need to get to the Brennans," she said. "But I need someone to stay with my mother and make sure this house doesn't get worse before I'm back." "How long to the Brennans on horseback in this?" 2 hours if conditions don't deteriorate. "More if they do." "Don't take your horse," he said. "Take mine. He's steadier in snow. I'll check the barn and then come after you." "I just said I need you here. Your mother has a loaded rifle and 30 years of frontier experience," he said. "She doesn't need me. The Brennans do." and you shouldn't go 3 miles alone in this. Clara opened her mouth to argue and stopped. She didn't stop because he was right, though he was. She stopped because she recognized the particular tone of a decision already made by a person who was not going to be talked out of it, and she had too much respect for that quality in other people to waste time fighting it. Fine, she said. Be ready in 10 minutes. They were out the door in 8. The cold was a different thing at that hour than cold in daylight. Clara had been out in hard winters before, had done chores in frost that cracked the skin on her hands and turned her breath into fog she could feel. But this was something underneath all that, a cold that was less weather and more intention, like the land itself had decided to test what it could remove. She rode Wyatt's gray through snow that was already thigh-high in the drifts and knee-high on the open ground, and the horse moved through it with the patient steadiness she'd noticed that first morning, the animal's breath coming in rhythmic clouds. Behind her she could hear Wyatt on her chestnut mare, but she didn't look back. She needed to look forward. She needed to read the ground through the white, because the landmarks she knew were gone: the fence lines, the road, the particular tree she always used as a direction marker, all of it erased or buried or made into something unrecognizable. She navigated by memory and by the angle of the wind, which she'd been feeling since childhood, and she got it mostly right, but not entirely right. And the 2 hours she'd estimated became 2.5 before she saw the Brennan roof through the white. The Brennan family was a mother, a father, and 4 children. Agnes Brennan was 32 and looked older, the way frontier women often did. Her husband Pete was a decent man with a bad tendency toward optimism that had left him consistently underprepared for the pessimism of the climate. The children ranged from 4 to 11, and when Clara knocked on the door and Agnes opened it, the cold inside the house rushed out to meet her and told her everything she needed to know before she could speak. "The wood ran out last night," Agnes said. She said it flat, without drama, the way people say things when they've been sitting with the worst possibility long enough that they've worn the edges off it. Clara pushed inside. The children were huddled in the main room, under everything woven that the family owned. The baby, the 4-year-old, was not making noise, which was worse than if she had been, because quiet children in cold houses meant children past complaining. "Wyatt," Clara said, not loudly, just with enough direction that he heard it, even through the wind. He had followed her in, and he was already reading the room the way she'd read it. He looked at her across the children's heads. "Wood? Cellar, maybe, and there's a lean-to around back." Clara went to the 4-year-old Lily, she thought her name was, and picked her up, which the child allowed without protest, and that lack of protest was alarming. The child was cold all the way through. Clara wrapped her inside her own coat and held her against her body and started talking to Agnes, fast and practical. How long had the temperature in the house been this low? Had anyone been coughing? Was there food? Was there water? Agnes answered everything calmly, and Clara catalogued it. The family was in poor shape but retrievable. They needed heat first, then food, then the decision about whether to stay or move them. Wyatt came back in 20 minutes with enough wood from the lean-to to build a real fire and keep it going through the day. He built the fire with the focused efficiency of a man who has been cold enough times to know exactly how important the next 20 minutes were, and within an hour the temperature in the room had shifted from desperate to merely grim. "You knew," Agnes said to Clara. They were sitting near the growing fire, the 4-year-old now genuinely warm and beginning to make the noise children make when they come back to themselves. "You came to us on purpose. You knew we were in trouble." "I guessed," Clara said. "I didn't know. You came anyway." "Yes." Agnes looked at her with an expression Clara wasn't used to receiving from most of Red Hollow: direct, uncomplicated gratitude that had nothing complicated inside it. "I owe you more than I know how to say." Clara didn't know what to do with that, so she did what she usually did with things she didn't know what to do with. She moved on to the next problem. "We need to talk about your situation," she said, "for the next few days." They spent 4 hours at the Brennan house. They got the family warm, assessed the food situation enough for 3 days if they were careful, and made a plan. Wyatt would come back tomorrow with additional wood from the Whitmore stores, which were better supplied. Agnes would not try to move the children in the current conditions. Pete Brennan, who had been out checking on the animals and came back in red-faced and shaking, agreed to everything without argument, which might have been cold-induced, or might have been the clarity that comes when you've been frightened enough to let go of pride. They left in early afternoon, the sky a flat gray that gave no indication of whether the snow would ease. Clara's legs were half numb. Wyatt's face was raw in a way she could see even through the distance between them, and there was a cut on his hand from something in the lean-to that he hadn't mentioned. "You're bleeding," she said. "I know," he said. "It's not bad. I'll look at it when we get back." It's not bad, he said again, but he didn't argue about her looking at it. They were half a mile from the Whitmore property when they met the first of them. It was Dale Croft, on foot, bundled to the eyes, and behind him were 3 other men, one she recognized as Henry Purcell, and 2 she knew less well, farmers from the south of town. They had the look of men who had been arguing before they'd arrived, who had settled on a direction but weren't confident in it. Clara, Dale Croft said. There was something different in his voice. Not the knowing tone he'd used in the post office. Something scraped down to something simpler. We went to your place first. Your mother said you'd gone to the Brennans. I did, Clara said. They're all right now. It'll hold for today. We need help. It came out like it cost him. From Dale Croft, she understood it did. The Myers girl, Martha. She's in labor. Her husband can't get the doctor. The road's completely gone. The 2 women who know about birthing in this town are both snowbound on the north end. Clara looked at him. You came to me. You know things, he said. It was not exactly an apology. It was as close as he had. Your mother said you'd know things. Her mother had been right. Clara's mother had, in fact, spent 2 long evenings over the past year telling Clara everything she knew about difficult births, because Margaret Whitmore was the kind of woman who treated useful knowledge like stored food you kept it in the cellars before you needed it, because by the time you needed it was too late to go looking. Clara had not expected to need it this soon. She looked at Wyatt. He looked at her. Go, he said. I'll check on your mother and get back to the Brennans tomorrow. Go. Martha Myers was 19 years old and frightened in the specific way that young women who have never done something terrifying are frightened past the point of expressing it, folded inward, holding the fear in the only container she had. Her husband, a young man named Joel who was 20 and looked 15, and had the expression of someone who had never in his life felt so completely useless, met Clara at the door and said nothing at all, just stood back to let her in. The house was warm at least. Joel had done that right. The fire was well built, and there was enough wood in the corner for the duration. Martha was in the back room on the bed, and Clara went to her and did a quick assessment the way her mother had taught her, how far along, how close together the contractions, how the baby was positioned. The position was the problem, not catastrophically wrong, not the kind of wrong that meant certain disaster, but wrong enough that it was going to be harder than it should have been, and hard births in houses with no doctor in the middle of a blizzard had a history that Clara was trying very hard not to think about clearly. She pulled a chair to the bedside. Martha, she said. Look at me. Martha looked at her. Her face was pale and sweating, and her hands were gripping the bedsheet with a tenacity that told Clara everything about the pain level. I'm going to be honest with you, Clara said, because I think you're the kind of person who does better with honesty than with reassurance. Martha nodded, once sharp. The baby's not in the best position. That means this is going to take longer than you'd like, and it's going to hurt more than you'd like. But you're healthy. The baby's healthy by everything I can tell, and I'm going to stay right here until it's done. All right, Martha exhaled a long, shaking breath. All right, she said. Tell me about something, Clara said. While we wait, tell me about something you're looking forward to. Martha blinked. What? I need you talking. Talking means breathing. Tell me anything. What did you plant last spring? Haltingly at first, then more steadily as she found the ordinary words, the garden she'd put in, the particular tomatoes that had done well, the cat that had appeared out of nowhere in July and stayed. Clara listened and responded and watched carefully, keeping the conversation going with one part of her mind, while the other part stayed alert, measuring, assessing, making the small adjustments her mother had described. Joel appeared in the doorway twice. Clara sent him for water the first time and for more light the second, because having something to do was the only mercy she could offer him right now. It took 4 hours. 4 hours that were not smooth and not easy, and not anything Clara would describe to anyone who hadn't been there, because the particular truth of hard things is that the words for them are always smaller than the experience. Martha labored and Clara worked, and at one point an hour in, maybe a little more, Martha grabbed Clara's arm with both hands and said through gritted teeth, I can't. And Clara said, You are, which was the one true thing and the only useful thing. She was, and she did. The baby was born at 7:30 in the evening, in the middle of a blizzard, in a small house in Red Hollow, and it cried with the outrage of a perfectly healthy newborn who had just been introduced to the world and found it startlingly cold. Joel Myers, when Clara brought him in, sat down hard on the edge of the bed and put his face in his hands and shook for about 30 seconds before he got himself together. Then he looked at Clara over his wife's head with those young eyes, wet and direct, and said, Thank you. I don't have words for it. Clara looked at Martha and the baby. The particular tired, raw, extraordinary thing they were right now. The beginning of something so specific and unrepeatable that it made her chest ache in a complicated way. Take care of her, Clara said. For the next week, she needs rest and food and warmth. Don't let her do too much too soon, because she'll try. Martha smiled, eyes closed. She's right, she murmured. I'll try. Clara gathered her things and stepped back into the main room, and the cold hit her. She hadn't realized how warm the back room had gotten, and suddenly the exhaustion of the day arrived all at once, the weight of it landing across her shoulders like something physical. Dale Croft was there. He'd waited. He was sitting near the fire with his hat in his hands, and he stood when she came out, and she saw the question in his face before he asked it. Mother and baby are both fine, she said. He breathed out. Then he said, you should know Tom Aldridge has been organizing. Getting people together to share supplies. He's been asking. Dale stopped. Started again. He's been asking who knows what to do, who to go to for answers. Clara looked at him. Dale turned his hat in his hands. Your name keeps coming up. And not in the way it usually does. She held that for a moment. The exhaustion was very present, and with it, something more complicated, the strange dissonance of being needed by people who had spent years finding you unnecessary. People need to share what they have, Clara said. The families on the North End, whoever has extra wood or food, needs to get it to whoever doesn't. I made a list this morning. You have a list. I have several, she said. Come to the Whitmore property tomorrow morning if the storm breaks. I'll have more by then. She walked out into the cold. Storm did not fully break until Thursday, but it moderated on Wednesday. The snow stopped. The wind dropped. The sky went from white to the heavy gray that meant the worst was over even if the cold remained. Clara had slept 3 hours on a borrowed cot at the Myers house and been up before dawn because there was too much to do. She had her lists, not the theoretical lists, the careful planning lists she'd been keeping in her head since Tuesday morning, the actual practical ones, in her own handwriting on paper she'd found in the Myers house. Who had what, who needed what, which routes were passable, which families were at the highest risk. The order of operations for the next 48 hours that maximized the chance of getting through this without losing anyone. She had not thought about the land title in 4 days. She had not thought about Earl Dunmore. She had thought about Wyatt once, briefly, not about what he was or wasn't to her, not about the careful space she'd been maintaining around that question, but simply whether he was warm and whether her mother was all right. Both, it turned out, when she was able to get word. He had stayed with Margaret, kept the house warm, dealt with the frozen pump by midday Tuesday with a method involving a slow fire and cast iron that had apparently impressed Margaret enough that she'd told him he had a home at their table for as long as he wanted it. Clara had absorbed that information without comment. She was at the general store early Wednesday, not the store proper, which was still half buried, but the loading door at the back, where Hank Simmons, the owner, had managed to dig out access. She was running through the numbers on stored goods, trying to figure out what the town had versus what it needed when Tom Aldridge arrived. Came with Dale Croft, and behind them were 4 more men, and then a few women. Nora Hartley's mother, the woman who ran the seamstress shop, Agnes Brennan's sister who lived in town. They came and stood in the cold in a rough half-circle around Clara and her lists, and none of them said anything for a moment. Tom Aldridge spoke first. He took his hat off, which was a thing he did when he was being deliberate. I want to hear your plan, he said. Clara looked at him. Looked at the people behind him. You want my plan. We need to get food and wood to the North families before the cold comes back down tonight. Purcell's got the most wood. Croft has grain stores. But we don't know the routes well enough. Some of the roads that looked passable this morning were going under again by 8. You know this land better than any of us. He was right. She did. She had walked and ridden every inch of the ground around Red Hollow since she was a girl, had made it her business to know it, the way you know your own house in the dark, because knowledge of place was survival. And she had always understood that surviving required knowing more than the people who had decided she was worth less. All right, she said. She showed them the lists. She explained the routes, which ones held, which ones to avoid, which one that looked impassable from the main road was actually navigable if you took the long eastern angle that most people didn't know about. She told them how to organize the supply runs to maximize efficiency, which families to prioritize, what to look for when they got there, that would tell them if the situation was more serious than it appeared. They listened, all of them. Tom Aldridge listened with the focused attention of a man who had stopped filtering what he heard through, who was saying it, at least for now, and Clara was practical enough to take that for what it was: incomplete, contingent, driven by emergency and useful enough to use it anyway. Earl Dunmore was not there. She noticed his absence without attaching anything to it. There's one more thing, Clara said. She looked at the group. There are 3 families on the far north end who aren't going to be reachable by the regular routes. To get to them, you have to go through the Henderson Pass, which is blocked, or through the Whitmore land, which I'm offering. She paused. Use my land, use my south path. It cuts 2 miles off the distance and stays out of the worst of the drifts. Tom Aldridge looked at her. He was quiet for a moment. Thank you, Clara, he said. Just that. She nodded. She picked up her lists. She went to find Wyatt. He was at the north edge of the property when she found him, shoveling a path toward the barn with the steady rhythm of a man working through a big problem one manageable piece at a time. He saw her coming and stopped, and she could see in his face that he'd been waiting to see if she was all right. How's Martha Myers? He asked. Mother and baby both fine. He exhaled. And the Brennans? I sent Dalecroft and Purcell with wood this morning. They'll be fine. He looked at her for a moment. She was wearing everything she owned, and she had not slept enough, and her hair was doing something disastrous from 2 days under a wool hat, and she was aware of all of this and also too tired to care. You organized the whole town, he said. I organized the supply run, she said. The town showed up, because you told them what to do, because they were scared and needed a plan, and I had one. He was still looking at her. That particular look she'd been collecting these past weeks, the one she couldn't quite fully interpret and had stopped trying to interpret, because trying to interpret it led her to places she wasn't ready for. Come inside, he said. Your mother made something. She followed him in. Her mother was at the fire, moving slowly on the bad hip, and when Clara came through the door, Margaret looked at her the way mothers look at their children when they've been frightened for them, and are relieved and furious in equal measure. Sit down, Margaret said now. Clara sat. She was not in a condition to argue with her mother, and honestly, she was not in a condition to argue with anyone. She sat in the chair nearest the fire and let the warmth come at her face and felt the exhaustion sitting heavy in every limb. Wyatt set a bowl of something hot in front of her. He didn't say anything about it. He sat across the table, and her mother sat in her chair, and they were quiet together, in the way that people who have been through something together are quiet, not the polite quiet of people who don't know each other, but the settled quiet of people who have been up in the same dark. She ate. It was not elegant. She was too hungry for elegant. She was halfway through when she realized she was crying. Not loudly, not dramatically, just that her eyes had gone wet, and the tears were running down her face without any particular announcement, because she was exhausted, and because a baby had been born in a blizzard, and because the families were warm, and because she had 2 days ago stood at the edge of the cold and looked at all the ways this could go wrong and made her choices anyway. She put her spoon down. She looked at the bowl. Her mother put a hand on her arm and said nothing, which was exactly right. Wyatt looked at her across the table. His face was careful and open in a way that she was too tired to protect herself from, and he said quietly, "You did good." She picked up her spoon again. "I know," she said. Her voice was rough around the edges. "I just needed a minute." He nodded. He didn't push. He didn't say anything more, and neither did she, and the fire burned and the cold stayed outside where she had put it. And Clara Whitmore sat in her own kitchen and ate her bowl of something hot and let the enormity of the last 2 days slowly begin to settle. She did not know yet what the town would do with what it had seen. She did not know if Tom Aldridge's listening would outlast the emergency, or if Earl Dunmore's silence was genuine or merely strategic, or what a county letter and a pending affidavit added up to when the snow melted and ordinary life reasserted its ordinary cruelties. She knew the land was still hers. She knew the families on the north end were warm. She knew there was a baby in Red Hollow who would not have made it safely into the world without her hands and her mother's knowledge and her own refusal to stop when the options ran out. She knew Wyatt was sitting across the table from her, and that his presence felt, in some way she was still learning to admit, like the least complicated thing in her current life, which was extraordinary, given that 3 months ago he had been a stranger on a gray horse outside Mrs. Prentice's boarding house. The fire popped. Her mother dozed in her chair. Clara finished her bowl and stared at the fire and thought about all the ways a person could go through their entire life being underestimated by the very place that was supposed to be home, and how sometimes, not always, not without cost, not without the kind of damage that leaves marks sometimes in emergency strips, all of that down to what's actually true. What was actually true, she thought, was that she had known how to save those people. She had always known. The town had simply needed to get frightened enough to notice. The snow melted slowly, the way things do when the cold has been deep enough to mean it. Came off the fields and stages, first the south-facing slopes where the sun hit longest, then the flat ground, then finally the packed drifts in the shadow of the barn that held on into March like they were making a point. Clara watched it go with a complicated feeling she couldn't quite name. The blizzard had cracked something open in Red Hollow, and she was still trying to understand the shape of what had been inside. The first 2 weeks after the storm were strange. People came to the property who had never come before, not to mock, not to interfere, but to bring things. Agnes Brennan came with a jar of preserved plums and stood on the porch and said, very simply, that she wanted Clara to have them. Pete Brennan came separately the day after with a load of split wood that he stacked near the barn without being asked. Joel Myers came with his wife and the new baby wrapped in 3 blankets, and Martha stood in the doorway and put the baby in Clara's arms and said, "Her name is going to be Clara. That's all right." Clara looked at the baby, looked at Martha, said, "It's all right," in a voice that was only slightly unsteady. She was not accustomed to being given things. She was accustomed to being taken from her dignity, her standing, her right to exist comfortably in the town she'd been born in, and the reversal of direction was disorienting in a way she hadn't expected. She received each thing carefully, the way you receive something fragile from an unfamiliar hand, grateful and unsure in equal measure. Wyatt watched all of this from the edges. He kept working. The property had taken damage in the storm, things that needed fixing before spring, and he moved through them with his usual steady attention. But she caught him watching her sometimes, when people came and went, and there was something in his expression that was both warm and very careful, like a man watching something delicate that he doesn't want to disturb. She caught herself watching him back. She had gotten worse at pretending she wasn't these last weeks. The pretending had taken effort she no longer seemed to have. The letter from the county board arrived on a Friday. She knew what it was before she opened it, the official seal, the weight of it, the particular quality of dread that official paper carried when you'd been waiting for something to land. She stood at the kitchen table with the letter in her hands and her mother watching from her chair, and she made herself open it the way she made herself do most hard things, quickly, before she could think too much. It was not what she'd expected. It was not a denial or a threat or a formal challenge to the title. It was a request carefully worded, bureaucratically hedged for additional documentation supporting the transfer of the Whitmore property. A response was required within 60 days. Failure to respond would result in a review of the title's standing. 60 days, and Silas Booth had told her the affidavit from Ruth Cass would take 4 to 6 weeks. She sat down. Her mother said nothing for a moment. "Then how bad? It's manageable," Clara said. "If everything Booth promised comes through on time. And if it doesn't?" Clara looked at the letter. "Then I go to Granton again and make sure it does." She folded the letter with deliberate care and put it in the tin box where she kept the important papers. Then she got up and went back to the seed records she'd been working on. Because the spring planting wasn't going to plan itself, and she'd learned a long time ago that panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. She told Wyatt about it that evening. Not because she needed him to solve it. She had already turned it over enough to know what the steps were, but because she had gotten used to telling him things, and the not telling felt like holding her breath. He read the letter when she handed it to him. Read it twice the way she'd read it. 60 days is workable, he said, if Booth delivers. You trust him? I trust that he wants his fee, she said. Close enough. The corner of his mouth moved. You want me to ride to Granton with you? I don't need. I know you don't need, he said with a patience that was not impatience. I asked if you wanted. She looked at him across the table. Her mother was in the other room, the sound of her slow movement, a familiar background note. Outside, the last of the day's light was going gray-blue at the window. Yes, she said, I'd want that. He nodded like it was settled. Which it was. They rode to Granton 3 days later, on a morning that was cold but clear, the sky the particular pale blue that came after hard weather. The road was rough, the snow had left ruts and soft spots that the horses had to pick through but passable, and they made good time, arriving at Silas Booth's office by mid-morning. Booth was a small, dry man with the economy of motion that came from decades of handling other people's problems. He received them in his cluttered office, read the county letter with practiced efficiency, and gave them his assessment without ceremony. The affidavit from Ruth Cass will be ready in 10 days, he said. That's firm. She's cooperative, and her memory of the signing is clear. He set the letter down on his desk. The issue is not the affidavit itself. The issue is who initiated this review and what they're actually after. Clara had been thinking about this. Tom Aldridge sent the original letter, she said. But I'm not sure this is still Tom Aldridge. Booth looked at her over his glasses. Explained Tom has been different since the storm. He organized the supply runs. He used my land access without being asked twice. He's not a man who does things for free. She paused. Someone else is pushing this now. Someone with more to gain from the outcome. Booth tapped his desk twice, thinking. The county board doesn't initiate these reviews on their own. Someone has to keep the pressure on. Letters, visits, the right word in the right ear. He looked at her. Anyone come to mind? Earl Dunmore came to mind immediately, but Earl was not a man with connections at the county level. He was too local, too obviously mean-spirited, the kind of man that county officials found inconvenient. She turned the question around. Who benefits if the Whitmore title is invalidated? Whoever buys the land at a reduced rate in the resulting confusion, Booth said, which would be whoever is positioned to do so when the moment arrives. Wyatt had been quiet, the way he was quiet in conversations where he was listening more than contributing. He said now, who's been buying land around here in the last year? Booth looked at him, then at Clara. That's a county records question. I can find it, but it'll take a day. We have a day, Clara said. They stayed at a boarding house in Granton. Separate rooms which she had arranged before Wyatt could offer to pay for both, because some things she was still particular about. She ate supper in the small dining room alone, thinking through what she knew and what she didn't, and she was still at the table with cold coffee when Wyatt came in from wherever he'd been and sat down across from her. Around, he said. She looked up. Where? The saloon, 3 men at the bar who liked to talk. It's a skill, she waited. There's a man named Cartwell, Wyatt said. Thomas Cartwell, land broker out of Millhaven. He's been buying up properties with disputed titles, not illegally, exactly, but finding the properties that have thin documentation and pushing on them until the owners can't afford to keep fighting and sell out cheap. He looked at her steadily. He's bought 4 properties in the county in the last 18 months. He has contacts at the county board. Clara sat with that for a moment. The shape of it settled into place with the particular clarity of something that had been fuzzy until you finally saw it from the right angle. Not Earl, not Tom. Someone she'd never heard of, operating from a distance, using the county's machinery like a lever. He doesn't know who I am, she said. No, Wyatt agreed. He knows there's a property with a thin title and a woman alone managing it. That's all he needs to know. He's going to be disappointed, Clara said. Wyatt's expression did the thing she liked, that almost smile that was more complex than a smile. He doesn't know that yet. He will. She said it simply and meant it simply, the way she meant most things she said, and Wyatt looked at her across the table in the quiet of the Granton boarding house dining room, and she was too tired and too focused to do anything with the look except let it land. Get some sleep, he said. Booth's records will be ready by 9. She went upstairs. She did not sleep particularly well, but she slept enough. The records confirmed it. Thomas Cartwell had purchased a property 2 miles south of Red Hollow 6 months ago, a small parcel that had belonged to an elderly widow who had let the documentation lapse. He'd paid 30 cents on the dollar. He had also made inquiries, through an intermediary, about 2 other properties in the area. The Whitmore acreage was in the files. Booth laid it out for them with the efficient dispassion of a man who had seen this pattern before. He's systematic, Booth said. He doesn't create the vulnerabilities, he finds them. In your case, someone locally, I'd guess Aldridge, based on what you've told me, though at this point he may have been used without fully understanding the consequence, filed a letter that put your title into the review process. Cartwell's contact at the board keeps the review alive and escalates it. Eventually, the costs of fighting it exceed what the property is worth to you, and you sell. Except I don't sell, Clara said. No, Booth said, which is why it's important that we move quickly. He picked up a sheet of paper. The affidavit from Ruth Cass establishes the validity of the original transfer. Combined with the tax records and the bank correspondence, it builds a clear chain of possession. That should be enough to close the review. He paused. It should be. The county official handling this case is a man named Graves. I know him. He's not corrupt, but he's persuadable. If Cartwell's people are still active, they may try to delay the processing of our response. What do we do about that? Wyatt asked. Booth looked at them. You deliver the response in person. You don't mail it. You go to the county office, you present the documentation, and you make sure Graves understands that you are watching this process and that you have legal representation who is also watching. He looked at Clara specifically. And if you can bring anyone from Red Hollow who is willing to speak to your standing in the community, that wouldn't hurt. Clara thought about Tom Aldridge, about the man who had told her he would think on some things, about the supply runs, about her land used to reach the North families, about the changed quality of the way certain people looked at her now. I think I can manage that, she said. They rode back to Red Hollow the same afternoon, and Clara did something she had never done in her life. She went to Tom Aldridge's house and knocked on the door. He came to the door himself, which she'd counted on Tom, was the kind of man who answered his own door because he liked to know who was on his property before he decided how to treat them. He saw her and a look moved across his face that she couldn't entirely read, not hostile, not warm, somewhere in the middle where complicated things lived. Clara, he said. Tom, I need to talk to you. He let her in. His wife offered coffee, which Clara accepted, because refusing would have made the conversation harder, and she needed this conversation to go smoothly. They sat in the front room, practical furniture, a good fire, a house that had the solid, worked for quality of people who had built something real. She told him about Cartwell. Not everything at first. She watched his face as she told him the structure of it, watched to see if he knew more than he was showing, watched for the particular micro-expression of a man hearing something he already knows. She didn't see it. What she saw was something she recognized because she'd felt it herself, the specific unpleasant shock of realizing you've been used. Cartwell, Tom said. He said it flatly, like he was testing the weight of the name. He used your letter, Clara said. I don't think you knew where it was going. I think you were angry about the situation as you saw it, and you wrote a letter, and someone with more resources decided to make it useful. Tom's jaw was tight. He looked at the fire for a moment. His wife, who was a quiet, perceptive woman named Helen, was watching him from across the room with an expression that told Clara Helen had suspected something like this was coming. What do you need? Tom asked. He said it the way Clara had asked Wyatt once directly without preamble. I need you to come to the county office with me, she said. I need you to tell whoever's handling this review that the Whitmore land is sound, managed well, and that the community of Red Hollow has no objection to its current status. Tom was quiet for a long moment. I said something in that letter, he said slowly. About the property being, I used the word questionable. About the management situation. He looked at her. That was wrong of me. I knew what I'd seen that winter. I knew what you'd done during the storm. I had no business. Tom, she said. She wasn't interested in the apology. Not right now. It would take up time and emotional space she needed for other things. Will you come? He looked at her steadily. Then he nodded. Yes, he said, I'll come. She did not expect what came next. She had gone to Tom. Tom, apparently, went to others not at her direction. Not even on her behalf exactly. But with the energy of a man trying to correct something he'd put into motion. By the following morning, she was aware that Tom had spoken to Dale Croft, who had spoken to Pete Brennan, who had spoken to Joel Myers. She became aware of this because Joel Myers appeared at her door before breakfast with his hat in his hands. I want to come to the county office, Joel said, when you go. Me and Pete Brennan both. Clara looked at him. That's not necessary. It's not about necessary, he said. My daughter's named Clara. That means something to me. She had no answer to that. She stood in the doorway for a moment and then stepped aside and said, Come in and eat something. We need to plan. What they planned, over the course of 2 days, was something Clara would not have predicted 6 months ago. A convoy. Not a dramatic one, not torches and banners, but a practical, deliberate gathering of people willing to make the 40-mile round trip to the county seat at Millhaven to stand in front of a county official and say that Clara Whitmore's land was Clara Whitmore's land, and that was the end of the matter. Tom Aldridge, Joel Myers, Pete Brennan, Dale Croft, who came with his hat already in his hand when he arrived, which told her something. Agnes Brennan, who said she wasn't going to let Pete go without her, and that was simply the fact of it. Nora Hartley, who showed up and said her father had wanted to come, but his leg was bad and he'd sent her as his representative, and that struck Clara as significant even if she said nothing about it. 6 people, 7 with Wyatt, 8 with herself. The night before they left, she was sitting at the kitchen table reviewing the documents, one more time when her mother came in and sat down across from her. Mark moved slowly with the hip, and she'd been coughing more in the cold, but her eyes were clear, and her expression was the particular one she used when she intended to say something that needed saying. I remember when you were 9 years old, Margaret said. You came home from school with mud on your dress and a bloody lip, and you wouldn't tell me what happened. Do you remember? Clara remembered. She'd gotten into a confrontation with 2 older girls over something she couldn't even recall. Now the details had faded, but the particular burning feeling of it had not. I remember. You sat at this table and you stitched up the hem of the dress yourself because you said you didn't want anyone to have to fix what someone else broke. Margaret looked at her. You were 9. Clara looked at the papers in front of her. I don't know what to do with other people helping, she said quietly. Came out more honest than she'd intended, the kind of honesty that surfaces at the end of a long day when the guards are down. I know, her mother said. You never have. You were always better at doing than receiving. It feels she stopped. What? It feels like they could take it back, Clara said. The help, the goodwill, all of it. It felt reliable until now, and tomorrow I'm counting on it, and that makes it feel fragile. Margaret was quiet for a moment. That's not wrong, she said. People can take it back. Some of them will, eventually. That's the nature of people. She reached across the table and put her hand over Clara's. But some of them won't. And you've spent your whole life assuming everyone was going to be the first kind. and you never left any room for the second kind to show you different. Clara looked at her mother's hand over hers. Old hands, working hands, the hands she'd known her entire life. When did you get wise, she said. I was always wise, her mother said. You were always too busy to notice. They left for Millhaven at sunrise. The road was better than it had been. The worst of the spring mud was past, and while the wagon and the horses had to navigate carefully in spots, the convoy moved with reasonable speed. Clara rode at the front on Wyatt's gray, who she'd come to think of as her horse by now in everything but name, and Wyatt rode beside her. And behind them came the wagon carrying Tom and Helen Aldridge and Agnes Brennan, and the rest in a configuration that was slightly cramped and entirely untroubled about it. She had made this trip twice before, both times alone, both times carrying the weight of the problem in her chest the whole way. This time was different. She noticed the difference without being entirely sure what to do with it. You're quiet, Wyatt said, not accusing, just observing. I'm thinking, what about, she considered. My father used to say that the land doesn't care who you are. It doesn't care if you're liked or respected or beautiful or any of the things people care about. It just cares if you work it right. She looked at the road. I've been holding on to that for 13 years, like it was the whole answer. It's part of the answer, Wyatt said. Yeah. She looked at the mountains, still snow-capped, still enormous against the pale spring sky. I think I might have been using it to not need anything else. He didn't answer right away. She liked that about him, the way he let things breathe before he responded. Is that a problem? He said eventually. Or just a thing you noticed? Both, maybe. He nodded. They rode for a while in silence that was not uncomfortable, the kind of silence that had grown between them over months of proximity into something with its own quality, its own temperature. I need to tell you something, he said. She looked at him. His expression was the careful one, the one he wore when he'd been thinking something through for a while and had decided to say it. I've been thinking about after this, he said. After the title is settled and the county business is done. After, she said, I've been thinking about what I do next. He was looking at the road. Whether I stay. Her chest did something she didn't try to name. Have you come to a conclusion? That depends, he said. On what? He looked at her then directly with those steady brown eyes. On whether there's a reason. The word landed and sat there between them, clear and plain and carrying everything it was supposed to carry. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Behind them, she could hear the low murmur of conversation from the wagon, the sounds of wheels on road, the ordinary sounds of a group of people going somewhere together. She had spent 26 years being a person nobody chose. She had built herself around that fact so completely that the structure of her, the lists, the seed records, the careful plans, the walls around the wanting had become her. She had not known how to dismantle any of it without dismantling herself. She was not sure she knew now. She was not sure you could know something like that in advance. There might be a reason, she said, carefully, honestly. I'm still figuring out how to say it plainly. He looked at the road again. The corner of his mouth moved. I can wait, he said. She looked forward, too, at the mountains, at the pale spring sky, at the road that was taking them toward the thing she had spent months fighting for. I know you can, she said. That's part of the reason. The county seat of Millhaven was a larger town than Red Hollow by a significant margin, and the county offices were in a stone building on the main street that had the deliberate solidity of institutions that want you to know they have been here longer than you have and intend to be here longer than you will be. The man named Graves was neither villainous nor heroic, which was in some ways more difficult to navigate than either extreme. He was a mid-level bureaucrat in his late 50s with careful eyes and the studied neutrality of a man who had learned that strong opinions were professionally inconvenient. He received Clara and her documents, and behind her, the unexpected assembly of 7 additional people, with the barely concealed surprise of a man who had been anticipating a solitary woman with a paperwork problem. Clara let Booth do the formal presentation he had written up the day before, and was already there when they arrived, which she appreciated more than she showed. Booth laid out the documentation with the efficiency of a man who knew how to make a case land cleanly, the affidavit from Ruth Cass, the chain of tax records, the bank correspondence, the clear and uninterrupted evidence of possession and management since her father's death. Graves read through it. He read it again. He asked 2 clarifying questions that Booth answered without hesitation. Then Graves looked up at the people behind Clara, and Tom Aldridge spoke before being invited to. I'd like to say something, Tom said. I wrote the original letter that started this review. I want to withdraw it. Graves blinked. You want to? Withdraw it, in writing if that's what's required. The review was initiated on a misunderstanding of the circumstances, and the documentation you've just seen should close the matter. Tom paused. I've known Clara Whitmore her whole life. I've seen how this land is managed. The review should not have been initiated, and if I had any idea of the mechanism I'd set in motion, I would not have sent the letter. Graves looked at Tom, looked at Clara, looked at the small assembled crowd that had arranged itself behind her in the limited space of his office, ranging from Agnes Brennan's squared-off shoulders to Joel Meyer's anxious expression to Wyatt's quiet presence at the back. "Mr. Graves," Clara said. She had decided beforehand to speak at the end, not the beginning, to let the documentation and the people land first and add her voice after when it had weight. "I've managed the Whitmore property for 13 years. I've paid my taxes on time, maintained the land, and built on it. This review was initiated not out of any genuine legal concern, but as part of an effort by a land broker named Thomas Cartwell to depress the value of properties with thin documentation and acquire them cheaply." She set a second document on his desk, Booth's research on Cartwell, including the 4 previous acquisitions. "I believe you may want to be aware of that before proceeding." Graves looked at the document. His expression went through several adjustments. Clara watched him calculate the weight of the documentation, the number of people in his office, the fact that the person who had initiated the review had just publicly recanted it in front of witnesses, and now a land broker's pattern of activity had been placed on his desk in writing. "I'll need a day to review everything," Graves said. "Of course," Booth said. "We'll be in Millhaven until tomorrow." They stayed in Millhaven overnight. Clara sat with Booth for 2 hours going through the contingencies, then ate supper with the others, all 8 of them, at a long table in the boarding house dining room, a circumstance that had a slightly surreal quality she kept noticing from the edges of the conversation. Tom Aldridge and Pete Brennan, who had never been particularly friendly, discovered a shared opinion about seed suppliers. Agnes Brennan told a story about the blizzard that made Dale Croft laugh until he had to put down his fork. Joel Myers fell asleep in his chair before the meal was finished, and his head tipped sideways, and no one woke him because they were decent people. Wyatt was across the table from her, involved in a conversation with Helen Aldridge about horses, and Clara watched him for a moment, the way he talked to her, easy and genuinely interested, the way he made people feel attended to without performing it, and she thought about what he'd said on the road that morning. Whether there's a reason, she was still figuring out how to say it plainly. That had been true when she said it. But she was, she thought, getting closer to figuring. The shape of the words was somewhere inside her, solidifying the way things do when you stop fighting them. After supper, she walked outside alone, needing the air and the quiet. The street was nearly empty at that hour. The stars were out, clear and enormous in a way they always were away from town lights, and she stood on the wooden walkway and looked up at them. She heard his boots on the boards before she saw him. He came and stood beside her, not saying anything, looking up. "You think Graves will do the right thing?" he asked after a while. "I think Graves will do the convenient thing," she said. "And the convenient thing and the right thing happen to be aligned in this case." She paused. For once, he made a low sound that might have been a laugh. "That's a pragmatic outlook. I'm a pragmatic person." "I know," he said. "It's one of the things He stopped." She waited. He looked at her. The street was dark except for the light from the boarding house windows, falling in yellow rectangles on the boards. "It's one of the things I admire about you," he said. He said it quietly, and without ornamentation, the way he said most things. "There are a lot of things I admire about you, Clara." She looked at him. She was aware of the very specific nature of this moment, the street, the stars, the light, the fact of everything they had been through to reach this particular Tuesday night in Millhaven, and she was aware of the things she'd been carrying for months that had been slowly getting too heavy to carry the way she'd been carrying it. "Wyatt," she said. "Yes, I'm still figuring out how to say the plain version," she said. "But the short version is," she took a breath, "don't go." He looked at her steadily in the dark. She looked back. She didn't look away, and neither did he. And the night was cold, and the stars were out, and the words she'd said were small and enormous all at once. "All right," he said. "Just that, all right." She nodded. She looked back up at the stars. He stood beside her in the cold, and neither of them said anything more for a while, and the silence between them had a different quality now changed. Weighted with something new, not comfortable exactly, but real in the way that real things are a little uncomfortable at the edges. Graves made his decision the next morning. He called them into the office at 9, and he laid it out plainly, which Clara had not been certain he'd be capable of but gave him credit for. The documentation was sufficient. The title transfer was valid. The review was closed. He handed Booth a formal letter confirming the decision in writing, with the county seal. Clara held the letter. She looked at it for a long moment. 13 years she had been managing this land. 13 years of doing what needed to be done, of knowing what she knew, of being more than the town could see. She had walked into this building yesterday as a woman nobody had chosen, and she was walking out of it as someone whose name was now formally, irrevocably attached to the land her father had built. Nobody took a thing from her easily. The ride back to Red Hollow was different from the ride out. The conversation in the wagon behind her was louder, more relaxed, the kind of noise people make when something they were tense about has resolved. Tom Aldridge rode for a stretch alongside Clara and Wyatt and said, with the careful dignity of a man making peace with what he'd done, that he hoped the situation going forward would be different. Different how? Clara asked. Better, he said. Just better. He looked at her directly the way he hadn't for most of her life. You've earned better. She held his gaze for a moment. I had, she said, all along. It just took you a while to see it. He nodded. It was not a comfortable nod. Good, she thought. It shouldn't be entirely comfortable. Not yet. Fell back and she rode forward, and Wyatt was beside her, the gray horse and the chestnut, walking in easy tandem, the mountains growing larger as they came back toward home. Home, she thought about that word, what it held, what it had cost. What it was becoming slowly, unevenly, with no guarantee of anything except that she would show up for it every day the way she'd always shown up, and that she would not be doing it alone anymore, and that the face of the town was changing, had already changed in small, irreversible ways that the blizzard had made visible. She put the county letter in her coat pocket, next to her heart, which was a sentimental thing to do, and she knew it, but sentiment wasn't weakness. Not always, and she was 30 miles from home, with the spring sky enormous above her, and the land stretched out in every direction that was hers, that was confirmed and defended, and hers, and she decided she was allowed a little sentiment. She kept her eyes on the road. She kept her hands steady on the reins. She rode on. The letter from Graves sat in the tin box with the other important papers, and Clara found herself opening the box sometimes just to look at it. Not often, not in a way she'd admit to anyone. But the county seal on that document had a weight that was different from the weight of everything else, in the box not heavier exactly, but more final, like a door that had been properly latched after years of rattling in the wind. Spring came to Red Hollow the way it always did reluctantly, in stages with cold mornings that pushed back against the warming afternoons as though the season couldn't quite commit. Clara was in the fields by the end of March, working the soil rotation plan she'd been refining all winter, the one she'd argued about with Wyatt in pieces over 3 months of midday meals on the fence rail. He disagreed with her on the north plot, thought she should rest it another season, let it recover from the hard use of the previous 2 years. She'd disagreed. They'd gone back and forth about it with the kind of focused friction that is only possible between two people who respect each other enough to push. She rested the north plot. She didn't tell him she'd changed her mind based on his argument. He noticed anyway, the morning she started working the south expansion instead, and he said nothing about it, which was exactly right. There were things they were still learning about each other. That was one of the better surprises of the spring, the discovery that there was still more to learn, that the person she'd been getting to know over 6 months of proximity had depth she kept finding new pockets of. He had a dry humor she'd come to watch for, the kind that arrived quietly and left you laughing 10 seconds after he'd moved on. He was terrible at estimating time consistently, almost comically wrong, not in a way that caused problems, but in a way that she'd learned to account for by adding 30 minutes to everything he said. He read, which she hadn't expected initially, not because she'd thought him unintelligent, but because books were scarce on the frontier, and men who sought them out were rarer than they should have been. He had 3 in his saddlebag, worn and marked up, and she'd borrowed one, a natural history volume she'd read in 4 days, and returned with her own penciled notes in the margins, which he'd discovered and read with an expression she would have given a great deal to fully interpret. She was still learning to let herself be known. That was harder. She'd built such thorough defenses over so many years that dismantling them felt less like opening a door and more like taking a wall apart brick by brick, each one requiring its own separate decision. She did it the way she did most difficult things, methodically, without fanfare, one piece at a time. Earl Dunmore made his final move on a Saturday in April. Clara had expected something. She'd been expecting it since the county letter arrived, since the convoy back from Millhaven, since the slow visible turning of the town's regard. Earl was not a man who tolerated being on the wrong side of a shift without trying to push back. She'd known he would find a moment, and she'd been waiting, the way you wait for weather you can see coming, not afraid exactly, but braced. She was at the general store alone. Wyatt was at the property fixing the barn door that had warped over the winter when Earl came in with 2 of his oldest allies, men who had been with him in some form or another for most of Clara's adult life. The audience was smaller than it used to be. Several people who would once have been available for this kind of performance had quietly moved into a different relationship with Clara, or at least with her public standing, and Earl's crowd had thinned accordingly. He seemed to know it. His eyes moved around the store with a calculating quality, assessing what he had to work with. What he said was not the open mockery of the early months. That version of Earl was gone, not reformed, not improved, but strategically adjusted. He had watched the town shift, and he had updated his approach to something more corrosive, quiet, sideways. The kind of thing you can say you didn't say. I hear Graves closed the review, he said to no one in particular, in the general direction of Hank Simmons at the counter. Interesting how that worked out. 40 miles away in a room full of character witnesses, he smiled at the middle distance. Must be nice, knowing how to work a situation. It landed the way he intended it to land, not as an accusation technically, but as an implication. That the outcome hadn't been earned. That something had been worked, managed, performed. Clara Whitmore's legal standing had been produced by machinery rather than merit. Hank Simmons behind the counter was quiet. Clara was near the back of the store, behind the shelving, and she came around the corner before she'd made a conscious decision to do it. She wasn't sure what she was going to say. She knew she wasn't going to say nothing. But someone else spoke first. It was Agnes Brennan, who was at the fabric bolts and who turned around with a directness that made Earl take an involuntary half-step back. Earl, Agnes said, "My youngest daughter's name is Clara. Do you know why?" She didn't wait for an answer. "Because Clara Whitmore rode 3 miles through a blizzard that you were sitting out at home to make sure my family had heat and food. That's why. Now, I don't know what you're implying, but I'd think real carefully about whether this is the room to imply it." The store was very still. Earl looked at Agnes. Then he looked at the store generally, at Hank Simmons, who was watching him with an expression that had no goodwill in it, at the 2 men he'd brought with him, who were suddenly studying the floor, at Clara, who was standing at the end of the shelving and looking at him with that flat, patient gaze she'd been perfecting since she was a child. He left. He didn't say anything on the way out. He put his hat on and walked out the door, and it swung shut behind him. And the store held its silence for a moment, and then Hank Simmons said, "Agnes, that fabric you wanted came in Tuesday," and the ordinary world resumed. Clara stood at the end of the shelving and breathed. Agnes caught her eye across the store and gave her a small, firm nod. Not triumphant, just solid, like that's done. Clara nodded back. She picked up the things she'd come for and paid and walked home through the spring air, and somewhere in the middle of the walk she started smiling. Not a big smile. Nothing performed. Just the particular smile that surfaces when something has actually finally, properly ended. She told Wyatt about it that evening. He was at the kitchen table, cleaning the hinge hardware from the barn door, methodical work, each piece cleaned and inspected before being set aside, and he listened to the whole story without interrupting. When she finished, he set down the piece he was holding and looked at her. "Agnes Brennan," he said, "Agnes Brennan." He shook his head slowly, something warm in his expression. "Good woman she is," Clara said. "I've been underestimating her. You've been doing that with a few people." She gave him a look. "Are we cataloging my blind spots tonight?" "No," he said, picking up the hinge piece again. Just noticing, she sat down across from him. Her mother was in bed early. The cough had been better this week. The warmth of the turning season doing what the cold months had made difficult, and the house had the particular quiet of 2 people alone in it, quiet that had become familiar over months, and that Clara had stopped noticing the specific texture of because it had become simply ordinary. The ordinary texture of her evenings. She had not fully registered when that happened. The shift from his presence being notable to his presence being assumed. She thought about it now, tracking it backward, trying to locate the moment. She couldn't find it. That was probably what was supposed to happen. She thought the edges of a thing growing smooth until you can't find where it started. "I've been thinking about the community space," she said. Wyatt looked up. "What community space?" "The one that doesn't exist yet." She pulled a piece of paper from her coat pocket. She'd been carrying it for 2 weeks, adding to it in spare moments. Storm showed something. There's no central place for this town to coordinate in an emergency. No storage, no meeting place, no agreed-on system for knowing who has what and who needs it. She smoothed the paper on the table. "I've been thinking about the old Carver building on the East End. It's been empty since Carver left, if the town collectively used it." Wyatt set down his work and looked at the paper. She watched him read it, watched his eyes move through her notes, detailed, specific, with cost estimates in the margins and a rough map of access points. "You've been thinking about this for a while," he said. "Since the blizzard," she said. "I had 4 days at the Myers house with not enough sleep and too much time, and my mind went somewhere useful." He looked at the map. Tom Aldridge would need to be part of it. Tom Aldridge would need to think it was partly his idea, she said. Which I can manage. Wyatt looked at her with that expression, the one she'd stopped being able to pretend she didn't notice, the one that had something specific and unambiguous in it that she was almost ready to name out loud. You're going to build this town, he said. Not a compliment, exactly. An observation, like he was watching something happen and naming it. I'm going to try, she said. It needs building, and I know how. I know you do. She looked at him across the table, across the hinge parts and the piece of paper and the lamp between them. That's part of why you stayed, she said. It was not a question. He considered it. Part, he said. Not the biggest part. What's the biggest part? He looked at her steadily. You know what the biggest part is, Clara. She did. She had known for a while. She was not always good at receiving things. She knew it was different from knowing them. The receiving, it required a different kind of willingness. But she had been working on it, brick by brick, wall by wall, and she was further along than she'd been 6 months ago. Yes, she said, I know. He nodded, picked up his hinge piece. Kept working. And she sat across from him in the lamplight and felt the particular satisfaction of something named and real, not romanticized, not perfect, but present in the way that the best things are present with full weight, with full complication, without asking to be anything other than what it was. Community space happened slowly, the way real things do. It took 3 months from the first conversation to the first meeting held in the Carver building. And those 3 months were not smooth. There were disagreements about funding, about responsibility, about whose idea it was and what that meant, about what should be stored there, and who had access, and a dozen other practical questions that turned out to be disguised arguments about status and trust. Clara navigated all of it with the pragmatism she'd applied to everything, not by pretending the conflicts weren't there, but by working through them one at a time, keeping her eye on what she was actually trying to build, rather than the social texture of the building process. She enlisted Tom Aldridge early, and she did it the way she'd said she would, not by asking him to participate, but by asking his opinion on a structural question about the building's roof, which was a real question she had, and which happened to pull him into a conversation about the larger project. Tom was a man who engaged with problems he'd been invited to engage with, and once he'd engaged, he was in. He brought resources, not money, but influence and muscle, and the willingness to show up, and Clara accepted everything he offered without comment on the distance between who he'd been 6 months ago and who he was now. She thought about that sometimes. The distance between who a person had been and who they were capable of becoming, and whether the distance meant the later version wasn't real. She had decided it didn't. People were not their worst moments any more than she was. Her worst any more than she was, the woman Earl Dunmore had tried to make her. The one nobody chose, the one not worth the trouble of seeing clearly. She had been that woman in the eyes of this town, and she was not that woman, and the town had unevenly, incompletely, with all the mess of real change, rather than the cleanliness of story, begun to see the difference. Agnes Brennan organized the food stores. Joel Myers, who turned out to have a capacity for detail that his young age had previously hidden from view, took on the record-keeping. Nora Hartley started what she called somewhat grandly a lending library, which at first consisted of 11 books and grew over the next 2 months to 23, which was a start. Wyatt built the shelving. He was good at it, better than Clara had expected, and she told him so. Where'd you learn to do that? She asked, watching him true up a shelf edge. Carpenter in Missouri. Spent a winter with him when I was about 20. He checked the level. It's useful. You can do a lot with wood and a little patience. You can do a lot with most things and a little patience, she said. He looked over his shoulder at her. Is that directed at me specifically, or are you just making conversation? Both, she said, and walked away before he could see the smile. The thing with Earl Dunmore did not end entirely with Agnes Brennan's confrontation in the general store. Things rarely end that cleanly. He was still in Red Hollow, still the man he'd always been, still capable of the kind of low-grade corrosion that doesn't headline but accumulates. Clara knew this. She had made peace with the fact that some people in a place will never change, will always represent the part of the world that looks at someone and sees only what's easy to dismiss. What changed was the ratio. That was the real victory. If you could call it that, not the defeat of a person, but the shifting of what was normal. Earl's comments landed differently when the room he was in had a different composition. When Agnes was there, or Tom, or Hank Simmons, who had decided somewhere around the time of the county letter that he was done being a passive audience to things he didn't believe in. When Joel Myers' wife brought baby Clara into the store on a Tuesday morning, and the baby reached for Clara Whitmore's finger with the unself-conscious grip of an infant who had no opinions about anyone's appearance or standing and simply recognized warmth. Some things shift and don't shift back. That's both a comfort and a warning, Clara thought, depending on which direction the shift is going. The warning she carried quietly, in the part of her that had been burned enough times to know that ground gained could be lost. Kept the lists, she kept the records. She stayed observant, stayed practical, stayed herself, which was, she had concluded after 26 years of field research, the most effective long-term strategy she had access to. She did not become comfortable in the way that makes you stop paying attention. Comfort was not the goal. The goal was something more durable than comfort, something she thought of as standing. The right to stand where you were without apology, without justification, without having to prove it over and over to people who had decided not to see it. She was still working on that. She thought she might be working on it for the rest of her life. That seemed right. The proposal, if you could call it, that happened in October. Not romantically staged, not the way stories usually tell it, with a specific moment and a specific setting designed for the purpose. It happened the way most real things happened between Clara and Wyatt, which was in the middle of something else. They were fixing the north fence, the one she'd been working, when he first came to stand at the field's edge and tell her a stake was 3 inches off. And it was a cool October morning, the leaves turning on the trees along the property line, the air carrying that particular autumn quality that felt like the world taking a breath before winter. She was working on a post, and he was 20 feet away working on another, and they were talking across the distance, a conversation that had started about the fence and drifted, as their conversations often did, through several other territories, the community building's winter preparations. A letter she'd gotten from Silas Booth confirming the Cartwell situation had been reported to county authorities and was being investigated, her mother's hip, which had been worse in the cooling weather. She should see the doctor in Granton, Wyatt said. She won't go. You could make her. You clearly don't know my mother as well as you think you do. He was quiet for a moment, working then Clara. Something in the way he said her name made her stop. She looked up. He was not doing anything dramatic. He was standing with a fence post in his hand, looking at her across 20 feet of October grass, and his expression was the open, careful one that she'd been collecting for almost a year. I want to ask you something, he said. She waited. I want to ask you to marry me, he said. I've been thinking about when and how to do it, and I can't find the right time, because I think maybe there isn't a right time. There's just time, and we're in some of it right now. He looked at her directly. So will you? Clara stood with her hands on the fence post. The trees along the property line rustled. The sky was very blue, the specific October blue that is the clearest blue of the year. She had known it was coming. She had known the shape of it for months, had seen it forming in the space between them, the way weather forms gradually, then all at once, undeniable once you could see it clearly. She had thought about how she would answer. She had thought about all the things you think about when you're a person who has been told their whole life they weren't worth choosing, and then someone chooses them, the disbelief, the old defensive voice that says, it won't last. Careful bracing against something going wrong. She had thought about all of that, and she had concluded, after months of thinking, that there was a choice between two kinds of living, the kind that protects itself against disappointment so thoroughly that nothing good can get in, or the kind that accepts the risk because the alternative is just a slower way of being alone. She had been alone long enough to know which one she wanted. Yes, she said. He nodded, like she'd confirmed something he'd already known but had needed to hear. All right, he said. All right, she said. They went back to the fence. She was smiling for the rest of the morning, and she didn't bother pretending she wasn't. And he had an expression she could only describe as settled, the look of a man who had been moving for a long time and had found the place where the moving could stop. Her mother, when told, said finally, and then I've been waiting 6 months to say that, and then she cried, which she would have denied if anyone had asked her about it later. They married in December, in the community building that Clara had put into motion and Wyatt had shelved, with the people of Red Hollow filling the spaces in a configuration that would have been unimaginable a year ago. Not all of them. Earl Dunmore was not there, which was fine, which was more than fine. But enough of them that the room had warmth in it that had nothing to do with the fire. Agnes Brennan stood in the front row and held little Clara Myers, who was 4 months old and entirely unimpressed by the ceremony, until Wyatt said something quietly to her halfway through that made the baby laugh, which made the whole room laugh, which was the most honest moment of the whole proceeding, and the one Clara remembered clearest afterward. Tom Aldridge shook Wyatt's hand at the end, with the sincerity of a man who had done the work of revising his own understanding and was living in the result. He shook Clara's hand too, which was slightly awkward for both of them, and exactly right, because that awkwardness was real, was the appropriate texture of the distance between where they'd been and where they were. Nora Hartley cried, which surprised Clara. She'd thought Nora was too composed for public crying. She revised her understanding of Nora accordingly. Silas Booth had sent a letter from Granton, which arrived 3 days before the wedding, confirming that the county investigation into Thomas Cartwell had resulted in a formal censure and a requirement that the 4 properties he'd acquired through manipulated title reviews be offered back to their original owners at the purchase price. Clara read the letter 3 times. She put it in the tin box. She did not cry, but she was quiet for a long time after, in a way that Wyatt left alone and her mother understood, and neither of them pressed her on. Some things take a while to fully land. The vindication of something you've been defending your whole life is not a simple feeling. It has layers, and the deeper ones take time to surface the grief underneath the relief, the anger underneath the grief, the long exhausted feeling of finally being able to set down something you've been carrying. For so long you forgot it had weight. She set it down, not all at once, piece by piece, the same way she'd dismantled the walls, the same way she'd done everything methodically, without fanfare, in the order that made sense. The winter of that year was hard but not catastrophic. They were ready for it. The community building had stores. The distribution system had been tested. The families who'd been most vulnerable the previous year had been quietly, practically bolstered before the cold arrived. Clara had seen to it. She had seen to it without making a performance of it, without requiring acknowledgement, because she had never actually needed the acknowledgement. She had needed the outcome, and the outcome was what she planned for. Old Samuel at the east edge of town made it through without crisis for the first time in several years, because Joel Myers had made it his business to check on him twice a week. Martha Myers had started keeping a supply list of her own, modeled on Clara's, because she'd asked to see it once and studied it with the focused attention of someone learning a language they'd needed for a long time. Things spread when they're useful. That was something Clara had always believed, that good practice, the kind that actually works rather than the kind that makes people feel good about themselves, propagates through observation. You do the thing that works and other people watch, and eventually some of them do it too, and the town becomes incrementally more capable, more resilient, more able to get through what it has to get through. She didn't think of it as a legacy. That word felt too large and too finished for something that was still happening. Thought of it as infrastructure, the unglamorous, essential kind that nobody talks about until it's not there. On a morning in late January, when the cold was back and the ground was frozen, and the light was the thin white light of deep winter, Clara stood at the north fence, the one they'd fixed together, the one that had brought him across the field that first time, and looked at the land. It looked the way it always looked in winter, stripped of its leaves, all structure and no softness, the bones of it visible in a way the other seasons covered. She preferred it this way, if she was honest. She always had. She liked knowing what was underneath. The Whitmore land. Her land. Hers in the way that only becomes possible when something has been defended fully yours, because you had to fight to keep it, which changes the quality of the possession into something more specific than simple ownership. She heard boots on the frozen ground and didn't turn around. She knew the sound. She'd known it since the fall. Wyatt came to stand beside her. He was carrying coffee, which she took from him without ceremony, and he stood there looking at the land the same way she was looking at it, not romantically, not with the performed appreciation of someone trying to feel something, just looking. Seeing it. The south expansion will be ready to plant in March if the thaw comes on time, she said. If, he said, I've got contingency for 2 weeks late. Of course you do. She drank her coffee. The frozen ground was quiet. A crow called somewhere over the far tree line, and the sound carried in the cold air with unusual clarity. I've been thinking about the Carver building roof, she said. If we shore up the east side before spring, Clara, he said. What? Can you be here for 1 minute without a plan? She considered this. Probably not. Try. She stood beside him and looked at the land without thinking about anything she needed to do to it. It was harder than it sounded. Her mind kept reaching for the next thing, the list underneath the list, the contingency under the contingency. She had been built for forward motion, had built herself for it, and pure stillness felt like standing on ice possible, but requiring constant small adjustments to maintain. She managed about 45 seconds. The east side of that roof, she said. Wyatt made a sound that might have been a laugh. All right, he said. Don't tell me to stop. I wasn't going to. She looked at him. He was watching her with the expression she'd been collecting since the beginning. The one she had finally, fully named, not just admiration, not just affection, but the particular regard of someone who sees you completely and is not made small by it, who finds the entirety of you, including the parts you find difficult to live with, to be the exact right amount of someone. She had not been looked at that way before him. She had not known you could be looked at that way. She thought sometimes about what the town had almost taken from her. Not just the land, though. The land was real, and the fight for it had been real, but the deeper thing that the land represented, the right to be here. The right to be a person of substance and standing and consequence in the place she'd been born, rather than the woman nobody chose, the woman who took up too much space in all the wrong ways. The cautionary example the town held up when it wanted to remind itself what failure looked like. She had almost let them define that for her. She had come very close over 26 years to accepting their version of her as the accurate one. She understood now that this was what sustained cruelty does. It doesn't always win by defeating you directly. It wins by getting you to do it yourself, to take up the judgment and apply it from the inside until you can't distinguish their voice from your own. She had not accepted it, not entirely, not finally. There had always been something in her that refused, some stubborn, inconvenient core that kept saying, I know what I know. I know what I can do. I know what this land needs and what those families needed and what the right answer is, regardless of what you're willing to see. That refusal had saved her, not dramatically, not with a single decisive moment. With every ordinary Tuesday, every morning she got up and went to work. Every time she kept the records and made the lists and stayed in motion when stopping would have been easier. She wanted to say something to Wyatt about this, about what it meant to have been seen by someone when the whole surrounding world had decided not to look. She turned it over in her mind and couldn't find the version that was accurate without being too large for words. The best she could do was, I'm glad you stopped in Red Hollow, she said. He looked at her. I almost didn't, he said. I was going to push through to the next town. What stopped you? He thought about it. Horse needed water, he said. And I was hungry. She stared at him. That's it? That's it. She absorbed this. That's a very small reason for everything that happened. Most things are, he said, small reasons, big results. He looked at the land. A door being open or closed, a horse being thirsty. A woman carrying rope across a market square. She thought about the rope, the market day, the way she'd set it down when Earl had started in, the way she'd turned, the way the hand had come down on Earl's shoulder before she'd processed it was happening. I thought you were interfering, she said. You thought it for about 30 seconds, and then you decided it was all right. I decided it was better than the alternative. Same thing, he said, from where I was standing. The crow called again, farther away now, and the sound faded into the winter quiet. The coffee was going cold in her hands, but she kept holding it, standing in the frozen field with the bones of the land visible all around her, and the man beside her, who had been a stranger on a gray horse and was now hers, she supposed, was the word, though she turned it around and found it worked in both directions, which was the only version of it she had ever been interested in. There is a particular kind of person the frontier produces, or maybe more accurately reveals. People who were already that way, who simply needed the conditions to strip everything down to what was actually there. Clara Whitmore was that kind of person. She had been that kind of person at 9, stitching her own dress because she didn't want anyone to fix what someone else had broken. She had been it at 13 when her father died, and she'd turned to the work before the grief had finished arriving. Because the work was real, and the grief was too large, and the combination of both was the only thing that kept her standing. She had been it at 26, walking out of a general store with shaking hands after saying the truest thing she'd ever said to Earl Dunmore, and she had been it in a blizzard with a stranger's baby in her arms and the cold trying to win. Strength is not the absence of fear, or the absence of doubt, or the absence of the particular ache that comes from being told you don't matter by the place that raised you. Strength is what's there when all of those things are also there. It's the stubbornness underneath the wound, the refusal to revise yourself downward, to fit someone else's small vision of what you should be. She had that. She'd had it all along. The town had just needed a winter cold enough to need it. And Wyatt was something she had not planned for and could not have planned for, because the best things are always like that. Not the things you build lists around, not the things you plan contingencies for, but the ones that arrive sideways in your life while you're carrying rope across a market square and change the entire calculation without asking your permission first. She had spent her whole life knowing the land. Learning that she could also know a person really know them, and be known in return was something different. Something that required she stop protecting herself long enough to be visible. She was still learning that. She thought she would be learning it for a long time. Red Hollow was not transformed. She had stopped expecting transformation, which was part of what had allowed her to build something real. Real change is not transformation, it's accumulation. The lending library with 23 books. It's Agnes Brennan turning around at the fabric bolts. Tom Aldridge shaking hands with both of them at a December wedding, with the appropriate awkwardness of a man doing the right thing and knowing it's late. It's Martha Myers keeping a supply list. It's a baby named Clara who would grow up in a town that was, in the small incremental way of real things, a little better than the one Clara Whitmore had grown up in. That was enough. That was she had come to understand more than enough. The biggest changes in any place are made of 1,000 small ones, and the people who make them don't usually get monuments. They get the thing they fought for, if they're lucky, and they get to keep working in it. And some mornings they stand at a fence line in January, with cold coffee and a person beside them who sees them clearly, and that is a very large thing to have. Clara Whitmore had it. She had built it. Brick by brick, list by list, in the cold and the dark and the middle of other people's emergencies, on a piece of land that was hers because she had refused to let it be taken. She stood at the north fence and looked at the land and let herself, for once, without a plan, without the next thing already forming in her mind, just stand in what she had made. The winter light fell across the frozen field. The crow was gone. Somewhere in the barn a horse moved. Beside her, her husband, that word still new enough to notice, still with its own particular weight, finished his coffee and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed saying. She stayed there a while longer. The land held still, the way land does, patient and indifferent and entirely faithful to whatever you were willing to pour into it. She had poured everything into it, and it had given everything back. That was the deal, she thought. That had always been the deal. Not with the land doesn't negotiate, but with life itself, with the choice to keep showing up for the thing you love even when the cost keeps rising. You put in everything you have, and you do not get a guarantee in return. You get the possibility of it. You get, if you're stubborn enough and present enough, and willing enough to be seen even when being seen has cost you before, you get the chance at something real. She had taken the chance. She looked at the pale winter sky above the frozen field above the land that was hers. It had been worth it. It had been worth every hard thing, every humiliation, every morning she got up when she could have stayed down. There are people in every town, in every era, in every impossible circumstance, who do not accept the version of themselves that the world insists on, who keep, somewhere underneath everything, the true account, what they know, what they can do, who they actually are. Clara Whitmore was one of them. She was not special for being one of them. There are more of them than you'd think, but every so often, one of them gets the winter cold enough for everyone to finally need what they've always had. And that changes things. Slowly and perfectly, one small accumulation at a time, it changes things.